Sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in fear and mystery. When 11-year-old Clara Belle Johnson inherited a crumbling church from a grandmother she never knew, she thought it was just another burden. The old building sat on Missouri prairie in 1891, half swallowed by vines and whispered warnings from locals. Her faithful dog, Jasper, had always been brave, but something about that church made him whimper and refuse to cross the threshold. What Clara didn't know was that her grandmother had hidden more than memories within those weathered walls. Behind rotted floorboards and inside secret compartments, a $29 million fortune waited. But why was Jasper so terrified to enter the one place that would change Clara's life forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Hartwell farmhouse, where Clara Belle Johnson sat with her legs dangling from the old wooden swing. The rope creaked softly with each gentle push, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat during the 6 months she'd lived with her Aunt Minerva. At 11 years old, Clara had grown accustomed to life's unexpected turns. But nothing could have prepared her for what arrived with the mail that September day in 1891. Aunt Minerva emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron, her weathered face creased with concern as she studied the official-looking envelope that had arrived with the morning post. "Child," she called softly, her voice carrying that particular weight that adults use when they're about to change everything. "Come inside. We need to talk." Clara's bare feet touched the sun-warmed porch boards as she slipped down from the swing. Jasper, her loyal companion, a medium-sized mutt with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that shifted from brown to gold depending on the light, lifted his head from where he'd been dozing in the shade. The dog had been Clara's constant companion since her parents' death from fever the previous winter. A gift from a neighbor who understood that grief sometimes needed 4 legs and a warm heart to help carry its weight. Inside the modest kitchen, with its cast-iron stove and hand-hewn table, Aunt Minerva had laid the envelope on the oilcloth covering. The return address bore the name of a law firm from Kansas City, written in formal script that seemed to carry the weight of official business. Clara could feel her stomach tighten in her short life. Official letters had rarely brought good news. "Sit down, honey," Aunt Minerva said, settling her ample frame into the chair across from Clara. Her aunt had kind eyes, the color of autumn leaves, and hands that had spent decades working the land alongside her late husband. She'd taken Clara in without question when tragedy struck, opening her home and heart with the quiet generosity that seemed to flow naturally from women who understood life's hardships. The letter crackled as Aunt Minerva carefully opened it, her lips moving silently as she read. Clara watched her aunt's expression shift from curiosity to confusion, then to something approaching wonder. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, looking up at Clara with raised eyebrows. "Child, it seems you've inherited property from your grandmother." "My grandmother?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. She'd been told that both her grandmothers had died before she was born, leaving no family except for Aunt Minerva, who was her mother's sister. Your daddy's mother, it appears. Says here her name was Eulalie Johnson, and she's left you a church and the land it sits on. Aunt Minerva's voice held a note of bewilderment. "Honey, I never knew your daddy had any living relatives." "He always told us his people had all passed on." Clara stared at the letter, trying to process this information. A grandmother she'd never known existed. A church, a whole building, that was now somehow hers. At 11, she understood ownership the way children do, her doll, her bed, her dog. But a church seemed impossibly large, impossibly important for someone her age to possess. "Where is it?" she asked. "According to this, it's about 10 miles east of here, near Willow Creek. Says it's been abandoned for some years now." Aunt Minerva folded the letter carefully. "The lawyer wants to meet with us to handle the legal matters. But Clara, I have to tell you, I've heard stories about that old church." Clara's pulse quickened. "What kind of stories?" Aunt Minerva glanced toward the window, as if checking to see who might be listening. Folks say it's been empty for near on 15 years. Some claim it's cursed, others say it's haunted. Mrs. Whitfield from down the road. She told me once that strange lights have been seen there at night, and that anyone who tries to explore the place comes away feeling uneasy, as if summoned by the mention of unease. Jasper suddenly lifted his head and whined softly. His ears pricked forward in the way that meant he sensed something his humans couldn't. Clara reached down to stroke his head, finding comfort in the familiar texture of his fur. But why would she leave it to me? Clara asked. Why not to Daddy when he was alive? That's a fine question, child. The letter doesn't say much about your grandmother's reasoning, just that she specified in her will that the property should go to you upon her death. Aunt Minerva stood and walked to the kitchen window, gazing out at the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. There's something else, though. The lawyer mentions that there were specific instructions. You're not to sell the property without first investigating what she called the family legacy. The phrase sent a shiver through Clara, though she couldn't have explained why. Family legacy. It sounded important, weighty with meaning she didn't understand. She thought of her parents, simple farming folk who'd worked hard and loved deeply, but had never spoken of legacies or grand inheritances. Can we go see it? Clara asked. Aunt Minerva turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. I suppose we'll have to, eventually. The lawyer needs us to sign papers and such. But Clara, I want you to promise me something. We go together and we don't go exploring on our own. There's been talk lately about strangers asking questions around town, men in suits who don't seem to belong here. Some folks think they might be connected to those big land development companies that have been buying up property around these parts. Clara nodded solemnly, though inside, curiosity was already burning like a steady flame. A church that belonged to her. A grandmother she'd never known, a legacy waiting to be discovered. She looked down at Jasper, who had settled at her feet but remained alert, his intelligent eyes seeming to watch the conversation with unusual attention. That afternoon, while Aunt Minerva prepared supper and the September heat began to ease toward evening, Clara sat on the porch steps with the daguerreotype that had been tucked into the lawyer's envelope. The photograph was small and faded, its silver surface tarnished with age, but the image was still clear enough to reveal a woman with Clara's own dark eyes and determined jawline. Eulalie Johnson, her grandmother, stood in front of what appeared to be the very church Clara had inherited, though in the photograph it looked well-maintained and proud rather than abandoned and overgrown. The woman in the image wore a simple dark dress and a hat that suggested respectability without wealth. But there was something in her posture, in the set of her shoulders, that spoke of quiet strength. Clara studied the photograph for a long time, trying to see something of herself in this stranger who had shared her blood. Behind her grandmother, she could make out details of the church, tall windows, a solid door, steps that led up to what must have been a place of worship and community gathering. As evening approached and the first stars appeared in the Missouri sky, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She would not simply accept this inheritance passively as something that had happened to her. She would discover what it meant, what her grandmother had intended, and why a woman she'd never met had chosen to entrust her with something that clearly carried more significance than a simple building and plot of land. Jasper seemed to sense her resolve, lifting his head to study her face with those knowing eyes. "Tomorrow," she whispered to him, "we're going to see what grandmother left us." The dog's tail wagged once, slowly, but Clara noticed he seemed to shiver slightly, as if a cold wind had touched him, despite the warm September air. 3 days after the lawyer's letter arrived, Clara convinced Aunt Minerva to drive her to the church in the old buckboard wagon. The journey took them across familiar farmland before the road began to wind through increasingly wild territory, where prairie grass grew tall and unchecked, and the wind carried scents of wildflowers and distant rain. As they crested a low hill, Clara got her first glimpse of her inheritance, The church sat in a natural depression surrounded by ancient oak trees, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Even from a distance, she could see that the building had indeed been abandoned. The white paint was peeling and grey. Vines climbed the sides like seeking fingers, and the small cemetery behind it was overgrown with weeds and wild roses. Yet there was something about the structure itself that spoke of endurance. The foundation appeared solid, the roof intact despite missing several shingles, and the tall windows, though darkened with dust and spider webs, suggested a building that had once welcomed light and community. Jasper, who had been lying peacefully in the wagon bed during the journey, suddenly sat up and began to whine. The sound was unlike anything Clara had ever heard from him, not the whine of a dog who wanted attention or food, but something deeper and more troubled. His hackles rose slightly, and he pressed himself against Clara's side as if seeking protection. "Easy, boy," Clara murmured, stroking his head. But she could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his whole body seemed to quiver with unease. Aunt Minerva brought the wagon to a stop at the edge of the overgrown path that led to the church's front steps. "Well," she said quietly, "there it is. Your grandmother's legacy." Clara climbed down from the wagon, her shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. The place felt different from anywhere she'd ever been, not unpleasant exactly, but charged with significance she couldn't name. The afternoon air seemed thicker here, heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and something else, something that reminded her of old books and candle smoke. They approached the building slowly, Aunt Minerva carrying a ring of keys the lawyer had provided. Jasper followed reluctantly, staying close to Clara, but clearly unhappy about their destination. With each step toward the church, his distress became more pronounced, until he was whimpering constantly and pressing so close to Clara that she could feel his trembling through her skirts. The front door was solid oak, darkened with age and weather, but still sturdy. Aunt Minerva tried several keys before finding one that turned the lock with a satisfying click. The door swung open with a long, slow creak that seemed to echo in the stillness of the afternoon. The interior was dim, lit only by dusty beams of sunlight that filtered through the grimy windows. Clara's eyes adjusted slowly, revealing rows of wooden pews, a simple altar at the far end, and walls that had once been whitewashed but now showed patches of bare wood and water stains. The air inside was still and cool, carrying the musty scent of long abandonment mixed with something that might have been incense from years past. But it was Jasper's reaction that truly captured Clara's attention. The moment she started to step across the threshold, he planted his feet and refused to follow. When she tried to coax him inside, he backed away, whining and shaking his head as if the very idea caused him physical pain. "What's gotten into that dog?" Aunt Minerva asked, but her voice held a note of unease that suggested Jasper's behavior was affecting her as well. Clara knelt beside her companion, studying his face. His brown eyes were wide with what could only be described as fear, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he knew this place and knew it held significance he couldn't communicate. "You stay here, boy," she said softly. "I'll just look around for a few minutes." Inside the church, her footsteps echoed hollowly on the wide plank floors. The pews were arranged in the traditional manner, facing toward the altar. But as Clara walked down the center aisle, she began to notice details that seemed unusual for a simple country church. Some of the pew ends were carved with intricate designs, not the simple flowers or crosses one might expect, but more complex patterns that seemed to tell stories she couldn't read. On one pew, she found what appeared to be a map of sorts, carved directly into the wood and darkened with age. It showed lines and symbols that might have represented roads or rivers, and small marks that could have been buildings or landmarks. Another pew bore what looked like names and dates, though they were too worn and faded for her to read clearly. "Clara," Aunt Minerva called from the doorway, "I think we should go. That dog of yours is getting more upset by the minute, and I'm starting to think he might have the right idea." Clara was about to respond when something caught her eye. In the tall grass just outside the church's front steps, something glinted in the afternoon sunlight. She stepped outside and knelt down, pushing aside the weeds, to reveal a brass key, unlike any of the others the lawyer had provided. This key was ornate, its head decorated with intricate scrollwork, and despite its age, it showed none of the tarnish she would have expected from years of exposure to the elements. The moment Clara picked up the key, Jasper stopped whining and stared at her with intense concentration. His tail began to wag slowly, and for the first time since they'd arrived at the church, he seemed to relax slightly. "What did you find?" Aunt Minerva asked, approaching with cautious curiosity. "A key," Clara said, holding up the brass object. "But I don't know what it opens. It doesn't look like any of the others." As they prepared to leave, Clara noticed a figure standing near the road, partially concealed by the shadow of a large oak tree. The man, for it was clearly a man, though his features were difficult to make out at that distance, seemed to be watching them with considerable interest. When he realized he'd been spotted, he stepped further back into the shadows. "Aunt Minerva," Clara said quietly, "there's someone watching us." Her aunt followed Clara's gaze and stiffened visibly. "Get in the wagon," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "Now!" As they drove away, Clara looked back to see the stranger emerge from the shadows and walk toward the church. He was well dressed in a dark suit and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but something about his presence felt intrusive, unwelcome. "Who do you think he was?" Clara asked. "I don't know," Aunt Minerva replied, urging the horses to move faster, "but I don't like the idea of strangers lurking around your property. There's been too much talk lately about outside interests trying to buy up land in these parts, and not all of them are as honest as they pretend to be." That evening, as Clara sat on the porch with Jasper curled at her feet, she turned the brass key over in her hands, studying its weight and craftsmanship. The metal was warm from her touch, and she found herself wondering what her grandmother had intended when she left this legacy to a granddaughter she'd never met. The key seemed to pulse with possibility, with secrets waiting to be unlocked. Clara thought about the carved maps in the pews, the stranger watching from the shadows, and Jasper's strange behavior, his fear mixed with what had seemed like recognition. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, the brass key warm in her palm. "I'm going back, and this time I'm going to find out what this key opens." Beside her, Jasper lifted his head and whined softly, but when Clara looked down at him, she thought she saw something new in his intelligent eyes, not just fear, but perhaps a kind of resigned determination, as if he knew that their quiet life was about to change in ways neither of them could imagine. Clara returned to the church the next morning with a sense of purpose that surprised even her. She'd packed a small basket with lunch, brought an oil lantern for better light, and most importantly, she'd spent considerable time the night before convincing Jasper that they needed to face whatever waited inside that building together. The conversation with her dog, for Clara had always talked to Jasper as if he understood every word, and his responses suggested he often did, had been one-sided in terms of spoken words, but rich with the kind of communication that passes between companions who trust each other completely. "I know you're frightened," she had whispered to him as they sat together in her small bedroom. "But whatever grandmother left in that church, I don't think it's meant to hurt us. I think she left it for us to find." Now, as they approached the church in the morning light, Clara could feel Jasper's tension, but it was different from the day before. Less panic, more watchful concern. He stayed close to her side, his body alert but not trembling, as if he'd made his own decision to face whatever lay ahead. The brass key felt warm in Clara's pocket as she unlocked the church door. This time, instead of the hurried visit with Aunt Minerva, she planned to examine everything methodically. The morning light streaming through the dusty windows revealed details she'd missed the day before. The intricate carving on the altar rail, the way certain floorboards seemed slightly raised, and most intriguingly, the fact that while most of the hymnals in the pews were covered with dust and mouse droppings, One near the back of the church appeared to have been recently handled. Jasper followed her inside, this time, though he remained close to the door, as if calculating the quickest route to escape if necessary. Clara made her way to the pew where she'd noticed the clean hymnal, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The book was bound in dark leather that had aged to a deep brown, its spine reading "Songs of Praise and Worship" in faded gold lettering. But when Clara opened it, she discovered something that made her heart race with excitement. The pages of sheet music had been carefully removed, and in their place, someone had sewn new pages into the binding, pages that contained what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. The map was detailed and precise, showing not just the church and the surrounding area, but what looked like underground passages, hidden rooms, and markers that corresponded to landmarks she was beginning to recognize. The work was clearly done by someone with both artistic skill and intimate knowledge of the area. In one corner, written in the same careful hand, were the initials E.J., Clara Johnson. Clara spread the hymnal open on a pew and studied the map more carefully. The church sat at the center of the drawing, with lines radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Some of these lines appeared to represent actual roads and paths, but others seemed to indicate tunnels or underground passages. Small symbols marked various points along these routes. Some looked like tiny houses, others like crosses or stars. Most intriguingly, there was a large X marked in what appeared to be the basement or foundation area of the church itself, with a note in tiny script that read, "When the moon is dark and justice calls, the faithful shall inherit their due." "What do you make of this, Jasper?" Clara asked softly. The dog had approached cautiously and was now sitting beside the pew, his attention focused not on the map, but on something near the altar. His posture was alert, but no longer fearful. Instead, he seemed to be listening intently, as if hearing sounds Clara couldn't detect. Clara followed his gaze and noticed for the first time that the altar area seemed different from the rest of the church. While the pews and walls showed clear signs of abandonment and weather damage, the altar itself appeared to have been maintained. The wood was still polished, the brass fittings showed no tarnish, and the area around it was notably free of the dust and debris that covered everything else. She was studying this puzzle when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Through the windows, she could see Mrs. Whitfield, their elderly neighbor, climbing down from her buggy with the careful movements of someone whose joints had stiffened with age, but whose determination remained strong. "Clara, child," Mrs. Whitfield called as she approached the church. "I saw you heading this way and thought I'd better come check on you. This place has quite a history, and some of it isn't fit for a young girl to face." Alone, Clara tucked the hymnal under her arm and went to meet the older woman. Mrs. Whitfield had been a friend to Clara's family for as long as anyone could remember, and her knowledge of local history was legendary. If anyone could help Clara understand what she'd inherited, it would be this sharp-eyed woman with her silver hair and gentle hands that had delivered half the babies in the county. "Mrs. Whitfield," Clara said, "I'm so glad you came. I've been finding the strangest things, and I'm beginning to think this church is more than it appears to be." The older woman's eyes sharpened with interest as Clara showed her the modified hymnal and explained about the brass key. Mrs. Whitfield studied the map with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades learning to read between the lines of official stories and community gossip. "Well, I'll be," she murmured after a long moment. "I haven't seen anything like this since the old days, during the Troubles." She looked up at Clara with an expression that mingled respect and concern. "Child, do you know anything about the land disputes that went on around these parts 15, 20 years ago?" Clara shook her head, settling onto the church steps beside the older woman. Jasper positioned himself between them, seeming to sense that important information was about to be shared. There was a group of men, businessmen from back east, they called themselves, who came through here in the 1870s buying up land. They had official papers and government backing, and they offered good prices to folks who were struggling with bad harvests and debt. Mrs. Whitfield's voice carried the weight of old anger, carefully controlled. What people didn't realize until it was too late was that many of those sales weren't legitimate. Documents were forged, signatures were coerced, and families who had worked the same land for generations suddenly found themselves with nothing. "But what does that have to do with grandmother's church?" Clara asked. "Your grandmother Eulalie was one of the few people who recognized what was happening early on. She started keeping records, real records, with proper documentation of who owned what land before these carpetbaggers arrived. She worked with families to hide their deeds and important papers, using this church as a kind of safe house." Mrs. Whitfield gestured toward the building behind them. The trouble was, when the land grabbers realized what she was doing, they started putting pressure on her. Threats, mostly, but the kind that made it clear they were serious about stopping her. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Is that why she disappeared? Why no one knew she was still alive?" "That's part of it, I suspect. But there's more to the story, child. See, some of those stolen deeds were never recovered. And if the stories are true, your grandmother might have hidden more than just papers in this old church." Mrs. Whitfield's eyes twinkled with the kind of look that suggested she knew more than she was saying. There was always talk about a treasure, about gold and documents that could restore rightful ownership to dozens of families. But after Eulalie vanished, most folks assumed those stories were just wishful thinking. As if responding to the mention of hidden treasure, Jasper suddenly stood and walked toward the altar, his tail wagging slowly. For the first time since they'd arrived at the church, he seemed completely comfortable, even eager to explore. "Looks like that dog of yours knows something we don't," Mrs. Whitfield observed with a smile. "Animals often sense things we humans miss. Maybe it's time we trusted his instincts." Clara looked at the map in the hymnal, then at Jasper waiting patiently by the altar, then at the brass key warm in her pocket. The pieces of a puzzle were beginning to come together, though the complete picture remained frustratingly unclear. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said slowly, "if grandmother really did hide something here, something that could help people get their land back, don't you think we have a responsibility to find it?" The older woman smiled, her eyes crinkling with approval. "Child, I think your grandmother would be mighty proud to hear you say that. But I also think you need to be very careful. If those old land grabbers are still around, or if they've got people working for them, they won't take kindly to someone stirring up old troubles." As if to underscore her warning, they heard the sound of horses approaching at a rapid pace. Clara looked toward the road and saw 3 men in dark suits riding toward the church, their expressions grim and purposeful. "Speak of the devil," Mrs. Whitfield muttered, her hand tightening protectively on Clara's arm. "I think we're about to have some unwelcome company." The 3 men who rode up to the church carried themselves with the kind of authority that comes from money and political connections. Their leader, a tall man with graying sideburns and expensive boots, dismounted and approached Clara and Mrs. Whitfield with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and condescending, "I'm Robert Caldwell from the First National Bank of Independence. This young lady must be Miss Johnson, the new property owner." Clara stood straighter, instinctively moving closer to Mrs. Whitfield. She'd heard that name before. Caldwell was the banker Aunt Minerva had mentioned, one of the men asking questions around town. "I am," Clara replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "This is my church." "Indeed it is, Miss Johnson. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you." Caldwell's eyes swept over the building with the calculating gaze of someone assessing value. "I represent some investors who are very interested in this property. We're prepared to make you a generous offer, more than generous, really. For a building in this condition." Mrs. Whitfield stepped slightly forward, her voice carrying decades of experience with men like Caldwell. "The child just inherited the property. Mr. Caldwell, she's hardly had time to decide what she wants to do with it." Of course," Caldwell agreed, but his attention remained fixed on Clara. That's precisely why I wanted to speak with her quickly. These old buildings can be dangerous, especially for a young person exploring alone. There have been reports of structural damage, rotting floorboards, that sort of thing. It would be terrible if someone were to get hurt. The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Clara felt Jasper press closer to her legs, a low growl building in his throat. The dog's reaction to Caldwell was even stronger than his initial fear of the church. Every muscle in his body was tense. His hackles raised, his lips pulled back to reveal white teeth. "I appreciate your concern," Clara said carefully, "but I'm not interested in selling. I want to learn more about my grandmother's legacy before I make any decisions." Caldwell's smile faltered slightly. "Your grandmother, Miss Johnson, was a troubled woman in her final years. There were rumors, unsubstantiated rumors of course, that she was involved in certain irregularities regarding property records. It would be unfortunate if those old allegations were to resurface and complicate your inheritance." "What kind of irregularities?" Clara asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew, the kind that could result in lengthy legal proceedings, expensive court battles, and ultimately the loss of the property anyway. One of Caldwell's companions spoke up. He was younger than his boss, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his time in offices rather than under the sun. "It would be much simpler for everyone if you accepted our offer and moved on with your life." Mrs. Whitfield's hand tightened on Clara's shoulder. "I think this conversation is over, gentlemen. The child has given you her answer." After the men rode away, Clara and Mrs. Whitfield remained standing in the churchyard, the weight of the encounter settling over them like a storm cloud. Clara could feel her heart racing, but beneath the fear was something else, a growing anger at the way these men assumed they could intimidate her into giving up something that was rightfully hers. Those were the same men who threatened your grandmother, Mrs. Whitfield said quietly. "Or at least they're working for the same interests. They haven't changed their tactics much over the years." Clara looked at the church with new eyes, seeing it not just as an abandoned building, but as a symbol of resistance, a place where her grandmother had made a stand against powerful men who believed they could take whatever they wanted. The brass key in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if responding to her determination. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I need to find out what grandmother hid in there. And I think I need to do it soon, before those men decide to take more direct action." Together, they entered the church, and this time Clara went straight to the altar area where Jasper had shown such interest. The dog immediately trotted over to a specific spot near the altar rail, pawing at the floor and whining softly. When Clara knelt beside him, she could see that one of the large stones forming the altar's foundation was slightly loose, with gaps around its edges that suggested it had been moved recently, using a piece of iron from the old communion set. Clara was able to pry the stone away from its position. Behind it was a hollow space, and within that space sat a metal box, its surface green with age but still sturdy. The brass key from the grass fit perfectly into the box's lock. Inside the box, Clara found a treasure more valuable than gold, dozens of land deeds, property records, and legal documents, all carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. Each document told a story of theft and deception, of families who had lost their homes and livelihoods to men who understood that poverty and desperation could be weapons as effective as any gun. Mrs. Whitfield examined the papers with growing amazement. "Clara, child, do you realize what you found? These are the original deeds to half the farmland in this county. If these are authentic, and they appear to be, then dozens of families have legal claim to property they were forced to sell under fraudulent circumstances." Clara spread several of the documents on a pew, studying the names and signatures. Many she recognized. Families who still lived in the area, working as tenant farmers on land their grandparents had once owned. The Washingtons, who shared crops with a landlord and struggled to make ends meet. The Hendersons, who had been forced to sell their farm after a series of bad harvests and now worked for wages. The Morrisons, whose children had gone hungry while they paid rent on land that had once been theirs by right. But why didn't grandmother use these documents when she was alive? Clara asked. Why hide them away instead of fighting for justice? Because she was one woman against a corrupt system, Mrs. Whitfield replied sadly. The judges were bought, the law officers were paid to look the other way, and anyone who tried to fight back tended to disappear or meet with unfortunate accidents. Your grandmother was smart enough to know that she needed to preserve the evidence until circumstances changed. Clara felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These documents represented not just legal claims, but the hopes and dreams of families who had been wronged. Her grandmother had trusted her with more than a building and some land. She had trusted her with the power to right old wrongs and restore justice to her community. What do I do now? She asked. Before Mrs. Whitfield could answer, Jasper began barking urgently, his attention focused on the church windows. Clara looked out to see smoke rising in the distance, coming from the direction of Aunt Minerva's farm. Her heart stopped. The smoke was black and thick, the kind that came from burning buildings rather than cook fires or field clearing. And she realized with cold certainty that Caldwell and his associates had decided to apply more direct pressure to convince her to sell. We have to go, she said, gathering up the most important documents and replacing the others in their hiding place. If they've hurt Aunt Minerva, they haven't, Mrs. Whitfield said with grim certainty. They're too smart for that. But they're sending you a message, and it's one you need to take seriously. These men don't make idle threats. Clara, if you're going to fight them, you'll need allies. And you'll need a plan. As they hurried toward Mrs. Whitfield's buggy, Clara clutched the land deeds to her chest. She thought about her grandmother, working alone to protect these documents, and about the families who still didn't know they had legitimate claims to land that had been stolen from them. She thought about Caldwell's threats and the smoke rising from what might be her aunt's barn or chicken coop. Most of all, she thought about the choice that lay before her. She could take Caldwell's money and walk away from all this trouble, or she could honor her grandmother's legacy and fight for justice, regardless of the personal cost. As Jasper leaped into the buggy beside her, his intelligent eyes meeting hers with what looked like encouragement, Clara made her decision. She would not be intimidated into abandoning what was right. She would find a way to return these stolen lands to their rightful owners, and she would make sure that men like Caldwell learned that some things could not be bought, threatened, or stolen. The war for justice that her grandmother had begun would continue, and Clara Belle Johnson, at 11 years old, would be the one to finish it. The smoke had been Aunt Minerva's chicken coop, burned to the ground in broad daylight while she was at the market in town. No one had seen how the fire started, but the message was clear. Clara's continued investigation of the church would have consequences for those she cared about. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table examining the water damage to some of Aunt Minerva's preserved foods that had been stored near the coop, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She told her aunt about the documents she'd found, about Caldwell's threats, and about her growing understanding of what her grandmother had been trying to accomplish. "Child," Aunt Minerva said when Clara finished her story, You're talking about taking on some of the most powerful men in the state. These aren't just local bullies. They've got connections in Jefferson City, maybe even Washington. They've been getting away with this kind of theft for decades because they've got judges and politicians in their pockets. But that's exactly why it matters, Clara replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. If no one stands up to them, they'll just keep taking what isn't theirs. Grandmother started something, and I think she meant for me to finish it. 2 days later, Clara returned to the church with a new sense of purpose. This time, she brought proper tools for investigation: a crowbar, several lanterns, and a notebook for recording whatever she might find. Jasper seemed to sense the change in her approach. Instead of the cautious exploration of previous visits, he trotted confidently to the altar area and began sniffing along the wall behind it. Following his lead, Clara began examining the wall more carefully. What she'd initially taken for water stains and natural wear proved to be something more deliberate. Running her hands along the wooden panels, she found one that seemed to give slightly under pressure. When she applied the crowbar to the edges, the panel swung away to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in waterproof oilskin, was a leather-bound journal filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting. The first entry was dated 15 years earlier, and as Clara read, she began to understand the full scope of what Eulalie Johnson had undertaken. The journal revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond simple land fraud. Her grandmother had documented a systematic campaign by a group calling itself the Missouri Development Syndicate to acquire prime agricultural land throughout the region using forged documents, bribed officials, and intimidation tactics. The syndicate wasn't just buying individual farms. They were attempting to control entire counties, concentrating land ownership in the hands of a few wealthy investors from the East Coast. But more shocking was the revelation that the syndicate had been collecting not just land, but also the mineral rights beneath it. Recent geological surveys had suggested the presence of valuable deposits throughout the region, and the syndicate's ultimate goal was to lease those rights to mining companies for enormous profits, leaving the original landowners with nothing. Clara's hands trembled as she read further. Her grandmother had been more than just a record keeper. She had been the coordinator of an underground network of people, working to preserve evidence of the legitimate land ownership and to protect families from the syndicate's predations. The church had served as a meeting place, a document storage facility, and a communication hub for this network. Most remarkably, the journal revealed that Eulalie had been systematically intercepting the syndicate's ill-gotten gains. Working with allies in banks and legal offices, she had been able to redirect funds from fraudulent land sales into hidden accounts, building a war chest that could be used to fight back when the time was right. The total amount accumulated over the years was staggering, nearly $29 million, all of it representing money stolen from legitimate landowners. "The day will come," one entry read, "when these crimes can be exposed and justice served. When that day arrives, this money must be returned to its rightful owners, the families who were cheated, the communities that were destroyed, the children who were robbed of their inheritance. I pray that whoever inherits this burden will have the courage to see it through." Clara sat in the quiet church, surrounded by the physical evidence of her grandmother's decades-long fight for justice, and felt the full weight of what she had inherited. This wasn't just about a building or even about land deeds. It was about the power to restore entire communities, to right wrongs that had festered for generations, and to ensure that the powerful could not simply take what they wanted without consequences. But as she continued reading, Clara discovered that her grandmother's work had come at a terrible personal cost. The later entries in the journal spoke of increasing pressure from the syndicate, of threats against family members, and of the difficult decision to fake her own death in order to protect both the evidence and the people she cared about. "They know I'm close to exposing them," one of the final entries read. "Caldwell himself came to see me today, offering one last chance to forget what I've learned. When I refused, he made it clear that accidents could happen to people who interfere with business interests. I must disappear, at least officially, until circumstances allow me to emerge safely. The network will continue without me, and someday when the time is right, someone else will carry this torch forward." Clara realized with a start that her grandmother might still be alive, hidden somewhere in the community, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. The thought filled her with both hope and fear, hope that she might actually meet this remarkable woman who had shaped her life from afar, and fear that her own investigation might be putting her grandmother in danger. Over the following days, as word of Clara's discovery began to spread through the community, families began approaching her with their own stories. Mrs. Washington brought the original deed to her family's farm, kept safe in a family Bible for 20 years. Mr. Henderson showed Clara surveyor's maps that proved his property lines were different from what current records claimed. The Morrison children, now grown adults, shared memories of the night their parents had been forced to sign away their land at gunpoint. Each story added another piece to the puzzle of systematic theft and corruption, and each family's hope for restoration added to the pressure Clara felt to find a solution. She began to understand that she wasn't just investigating a historical injustice, she was being asked to serve as a catalyst for a community's healing. But with each new supporter came new risks. Caldwell and his associates were clearly monitoring her activities, and their patience was wearing thin. The burned chicken coop had been followed by other small acts of intimidation. Crop damage to neighbors who supported Clara, mysterious legal challenges to property titles, and official complaints about the structural safety of the church that could result in its condemnation and demolition. Clara found herself developing strategic thinking skills she'd never known she possessed. She began keeping duplicate copies of important documents in multiple locations, coordinating with Mrs. Whitfield and other trusted community members to ensure that evidence would survive even if something happened to her, and carefully planning each visit to the church to minimize the risk of unwanted surveillance. Most importantly, she began to understand that the brass key and the various hidden compartments in the church were only the beginning. If her grandmother had truly accumulated $29 million in stolen money, it would take more than a small box behind the altar to hide it. Somewhere in or around the church, there had to be a much larger storage system, possibly the underground passages indicated on the map she'd found in the hymnal. As October arrived and the leaves began to change, Clara knew she was approaching a crisis point. The legal pressure to sell the church was intensifying. Her investigation was drawing increasingly dangerous attention, and the community was depending on her to deliver justice that had been delayed for far too long. Standing in the church one crisp morning, with Jasper watching alertly from his favorite spot near the altar, Clara made a commitment that would define the rest of her young life. She would find the hidden treasure, expose the conspiracy, and restore the stolen land to its rightful owners, regardless of the personal cost. The only question now was whether she could accomplish all of this before the syndicate decided to take more direct action to stop her. The bell tower had always seemed the most dangerous part of the church to explore. The wooden ladder leading up to it was missing several rungs, and what remained creaked ominously under even Clara's slight weight. But after discovering her grandmother's journal, she knew that every part of the building needed to be searched thoroughly. If Clara Johnson had been as systematic as her writing suggested, she would have hidden clues in the most unlikely places. Jasper waited at the bottom of the ladder, whining softly with concern, as Clara climbed carefully toward the small chamber that housed the church bell. The bell itself was still there, though green with tarnish and draped in cobwebs. But it was what she found behind the bell, tucked into a weatherproof pouch made of oiled leather, that made the dangerous climb worthwhile. The silver compass was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, its face engraved with delicate scrollwork, and its needle still responsive despite years of storage. But when Clara held it level and waited for it to settle, she discovered something peculiar. Instead of pointing north, the needle swung steadily toward the southeast corner of the church, as if it were attracted to something specific in that direction. Intrigued, Clara examined the compass more carefully and found that its base could be unscrewed. Inside the hidden compartment was a tiny roll of paper, so small it could barely be read without squinting. But the message was clear. Where the compass points true, beneath the stone that bears my name, lies the key to justice for all who were wronged. Clara climbed down from the bell tower, with her heart pounding from excitement rather than exertion. She followed the compass needle as it drew her to the southeastern corner of the church, where she found herself standing before a collection of memorial stones embedded in the floor, markers for people who had been buried in the church cemetery but whose Families had requested indoor memorial. Blacks. One stone was larger than the others, and when Clara knelt to examine it more closely, she could just make out the inscription, Clara Johnson, 1825-1876. Beloved mother and faithful servant. The death date was clearly false. According to the legal documents, her grandmother had supposedly died in 1878, and Clara now knew she might still be alive. But the stone was real enough, and when she pressed on it, she felt it shift slightly under her hands. Before she could investigate further, the sound of approaching horses interrupted her work. Clara quickly pocketed the compass and moved toward the door, Jasper positioning himself protectively between her and the entrance. This time, it was Caldwell himself, alone, but carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had grown tired of playing games. He dismounted and approached the church with the confident stride of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "Miss Johnson," he said without preamble, "I'm here to make you one final offer. $5,000 for this property, cash in hand, and my personal guarantee that you and your family will be left in peace to pursue your lives elsewhere." "And if I refuse?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then I'll be forced to pursue other options. I've filed papers with the county claiming that this building is structurally unsafe and should be condemned. I've also discovered some irregularities in your inheritance documentation that may require investigation by the territorial authorities." Caldwell's smile was cold and calculating. "Legal battles are expensive, Miss Johnson, and they often result in the loss of the very thing one is fighting to preserve." Clara felt anger rising in her chest. Not the hot, impulsive anger of childhood, but the cold, determined fury of someone who had seen too much injustice. "You're the same men who stole land from half the families in this county," she said. "You're the ones who forged documents and bribed officials. And now you're trying to steal what's left of my grandmother's legacy." For the first time, Caldwell's composure cracked slightly. "Your grandmother was a deluded old woman who interfered in matters she didn't understand. She caused a great deal of trouble for a great many people, and it would be unfortunate if her granddaughter followed the same path." "She was protecting people from thieves like you," Clara replied. "And I'm going to finish what she started." Caldwell's expression hardened. "Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you about the consequences of your stubbornness." He remounted his horse and rode away, but not before giving the church a long, measuring look that promised future action. That evening, as Clara sat with Aunt Minerva discussing the day's confrontation, her aunt revealed a piece of family history that changed everything Clara thought she knew about her inheritance. "Your grandmother didn't just choose you randomly to inherit that church," Aunt Minerva said, her voice heavy with memories she'd clearly been carrying for years. "Your father was her son, but there was more to it than that. When you were born, Eulalie came to see you. Just once, when you were barely a week old. She held you for the longest time, studying your face like she was memorizing it." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Clara asked. "Because it wasn't safe. Even then, there were people watching the family, looking for any connection to Eulalie's work. Your parents thought it was better for you to grow up without knowing about that side of your heritage, at least until you were old enough to handle the truth." Aunt Minerva reached across the table and took Clara's hand. "But Eulalie left a message that day. She said you had the look, the same expression your great-grandmother had, the same set to your jaw that meant you wouldn't back down from a fight, even when you should." Clara thought about this as she prepared for bed that night. The idea that her grandmother had seen something in her as an infant, had chosen her specifically to carry on this work, was both humbling and terrifying. But it also explained things that had puzzled her. Why the inheritance had come to her instead of to her father when he was alive. Why the hiding places in the church seemed almost designed for someone her size to discover. Over the next few days, community support for Clara's mission grew in ways she hadn't expected. Mrs. Washington brought her 3 more families who had original deeds to stolen property. Mr. Henderson organized a group of men to take turns watching the church. ensuring that Clara could work without fear of interference. Even some of the younger people in the community, those who had grown up hearing stories about the old injustices, began offering their help in researching family histories and documenting claims. But with increased support came increased danger. Clara noticed strangers in town asking questions about her activities. Someone broke into Mrs. Whitfield's house, though nothing appeared to be taken. And most ominously, official-looking men began surveying the area around the church, claiming to be conducting a geological survey, but showing more interest in the building itself than in the surrounding land. Jasper's behavior during this period was particularly telling. The dog had become increasingly protective of Clara, rarely leaving her side and showing unusual alertness to sounds and scents that Clara couldn't detect. More significantly, his attitude toward the church continued to evolve. While he'd initially been afraid to enter the building, he now seemed eager to lead Clara to specific locations, as if he understood that time was running short. One afternoon, as Clara worked alone in the church trying to move the memorial stone that bore her grandmother's name, Jasper began barking urgently at the main door. Clara looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the afternoon light, not Caldwell or one of his associates, but someone smaller, more fragile, moving with the careful steps of advanced age. The woman who entered the church was clearly elderly, her hair silver white, and her face lined with decades of worry and determination. But her eyes were familiar, the same dark brown as Clara's own, the same intelligent sparkle that Clara had recognized in the daguerreotype. "Hello, child," the woman said, her voice carrying the warmth and strength that Clara had unconsciously been hoping to hear for weeks. "I think it's time we finally met properly. I'm your grandmother Eulalie, and I believe you've been doing some excellent detective work in my absence." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized that the most important part of her inheritance had finally revealed itself. But even as joy filled her heart, she could see the urgency in her grandmother's expression, the tension that suggested their reunion was happening because time had run out for more cautious approaches. "Grandmother," Clara said, crossing the church to embrace this remarkable woman who had shaped her destiny from afar. "I found so much, but I still don't understand how to access the vault. I know it's here, but you need more than a compass and a memorial stone," Eulalie finished with a smile. "You need someone who knows the full truth about what we've built here. And more importantly, you need someone who can help you act quickly, because our enemies have grown tired of waiting for us to make mistakes." As if to underscore the urgency of the situation, they could hear the sound of multiple horses approaching the church at high speed. Clara looked out the window to see not just Caldwell, but a group of armed men riding hard toward their location. "It seems," Eulalie said calmly, "that the final confrontation has arrived sooner than I expected. Are you ready to claim your full inheritance, granddaughter?" Clara looked at the compass in her hand, at the memorial stone that still needed to be moved, and at the grandmother she'd finally found. Despite the approaching danger, she felt a sense of completion, as if all the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The approaching horses slowed as they reached the church, but Clara could see through the windows that the riders were surrounding the building, rather than simply arriving for a confrontation. These weren't just businessman's threats anymore. This was a coordinated operation designed to ensure that no one left the church until Caldwell got what he wanted. "Quickly, a child," Eulalie said, moving with surprising agility toward the memorial stone. "Help me move this. We have perhaps 5 minutes before they work up the courage to come inside." Together, Clara and her grandmother managed to shift the heavy stone, revealing beneath it not just a hole, but the top of a wooden ladder that descended into darkness. Jasper immediately moved to the opening, his tail wagging for the first time since the riders had appeared. "Jasper knows the way," Eulalie explained, beginning to climb down into the hidden passage. "He's been guarding this place for me for 3 years, ever since I had to disappear officially. Every time you brought him here, he was trying to lead you to this entrance. But he couldn't reveal it until I was here to guide you safely." Clara followed her grandmother down the ladder, marveling at how the dog she'd thought was afraid of the church had actually been its most dedicated protector. The passage below was narrow but well constructed, with wooden supports and oil lamps already in place along the walls. Clearly, this wasn't a hastily improvised hiding place, but part of a carefully planned system. The Underground Railroad, Eulalie explained as they walked through the tunnel, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. During the war, this church was a station for people seeking freedom. We maintained and expanded the tunnels afterward, knowing they might be needed again someday for a different kind of liberation. The tunnel led to a natural cave that had been significantly enlarged and reinforced. Clara gasped as her grandmother lit the oil lamps around the chamber, revealing not just the promised vault, but something far more impressive. An entire underground room filled with document cases, gold coins, jewelry, and stacks of currency that represented decades of systematic wealth recovery. $29 million, Eulalie said simply. Every penny of it stolen from families in this region through fraudulent land deals, forged documents, and corrupt legal proceedings. I've been collecting it for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to return it to its rightful owners. Clara walked through the treasure room in amazement, but what impressed her most wasn't the wealth itself. It was the meticulous organization. Every pile of coins was labeled with the name of a family it belonged to. Every stack of currency was accompanied by documentation proving its origin. This wasn't a random accumulation of stolen goods, but a carefully maintained trust fund, waiting for the day when justice could be served. "But why did you have to fake your death?" Clara asked. "Why disappear instead of fighting them openly?" Eulalie moved to a document case and withdrew a folder containing what appeared to be official death certificates and burial records. "Because they were planning to kill me," she said matter-of-factly. "Caldwell and his associates had grown tired of my interference, and they'd arranged for an accident to befall me during one of my trips to the county seat. A friend in the coroner's office warned me just in time." She showed Clara the forged death certificate, complete with official seals and signatures. "We staged my death carefully, with the help of people who understood what was at stake. The casket they buried contained rocks and old clothes. I've been living quietly with different families in the community, moving every few months to avoid detection, but always staying close enough to monitor this place. And Jasper. Jasper was my dog originally. When I had to disappear, I arranged for him to be given to you, knowing that eventually you would inherit this place and need his guidance." Eulalie smiled as the dog pressed against her legs. "He's been torn between his loyalty to me and his growing love for you, which is why his behavior seemed so contradictory. He wanted to protect you, but he also knew his duty was to guard this treasure until the right moment came to reveal it." Above them, they could hear heavy footsteps moving around the church, voices calling out Clara's name, and the sound of furniture being overturned. Clearly Caldwell and his men had decided they'd waited long enough. "They'll find the entrance eventually," Eulalie said. "These men aren't fools, just criminals. We have perhaps an hour before they think to examine the memorial stones more carefully. Then what do we do?" Clara asked. "We face them," her grandmother replied. "But not the way they expect. Clara, you need to understand something important about what you've inherited. This treasure isn't meant to make you wealthy. It's meant to restore justice to an entire community. The question you have to answer is whether you're prepared to use it for that purpose, even if it means putting yourself in considerable danger." Clara looked around the underground chamber, thinking about all the families she'd met whose land had been stolen, about the children who'd grown up poor because their parents had been cheated out of their inheritance, about the systematic corruption that had allowed wealthy men to steal from poor families for decades without consequence. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to be the catalyst for the largest restoration of stolen property in Missouri history," Eulalie said. "I'm asking you to stand up in front of judges and politicians and demand justice, knowing that the men you're accusing have the power to make your life very difficult. I'm asking you to risk everything to do what's right, and if I say no, then you take whatever portion of this treasure you feel you're entitled to, and we'll find a way to escape through the other tunnels. You can live comfortably for the rest of your life, and no one will blame you for choosing safety over justice. Clara thought about this choice, realizing that everything in her short life had been leading to this moment. She thought about her parents, who had always taught her to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. She thought about her grandmother, who had spent 15 years of her life working to preserve evidence of these crimes. She thought about Mrs. Washington and Mr. Henderson and all the other families who were still waiting for justice. Most of all, she thought about the kind of person she wanted to be, someone who would walk away from injustice because it was easier, or someone who would fight for what was right regardless of the personal cost. "I want to do what's right," she said finally. "But I'm just 11 years old. How can I possibly take on men like Caldwell and win?" "Because you won't be alone," Eulalie said with a smile. "The community is ready to support you, now that they know the evidence exists to back up their claims. The federal government has been looking for an opportunity to investigate the land fraud that's been reported throughout this region. And most importantly, you have something those men don't have. What's that? The truth and the courage to speak it publicly." Eulalie began gathering specific documents from the organized stacks around them. These papers prove not just individual land thefts, but a systematic conspiracy involving multiple states and federal officials. When this story becomes public, it will destroy careers and send powerful men to prison. Above them, the sounds of searching had intensified. Clara could hear men's voices discussing the best way to break open the floor around the memorial stones. "It's time," Eulalie said. "Are you ready to claim your full inheritance, granddaughter? Are you ready to finish what I started?" Clara looked at Jasper, who was watching her with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand exactly what choice she was facing. She thought about all the families counting on her, all the justice that had been delayed for too long, and all the courage she would need to see this through to the end. "I'm ready," she said. And as the words left her lips, she felt something change inside her, not just determination, but a sense of destiny fulfilled. She was no longer just Clara Belle Johnson, the orphaned girl who had inherited an abandoned church. She was the granddaughter of Eulalie Johnson, the keeper of $29 million in stolen wealth, and the person chosen to restore justice to an entire community. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Clara knew that whatever happened next would determine not just her own future, but the future of everyone who had been wronged by the powerful men now searching for her above. The underground chamber had a second exit that Eulalie had never mentioned, a tunnel that emerged nearly a quarter-mile away in a grove of trees behind the Washington family's property. As they made their careful way through the narrow passage, Clara's grandmother explained the plan that had been years in the making. "We always knew this moment would come," Eulalie said, her voice echoing softly in the confined space. "The evidence we've gathered is too damaging to remain hidden forever. The question was never whether we would have to face them, but when and how we would choose to do it." They emerged from the tunnel into the grey light of late afternoon, where Mrs. Washington was waiting with a wagon and a look of grim determination. Clara realized that her grandmother's network of allies was far more extensive than she had imagined. This wasn't a desperate improvisation, but the execution of a carefully prepared strategy. "The others are gathering at the schoolhouse," Mrs. Washington reported as they climbed into the wagon. Word spread quickly once people realized Eulalie was alive and the final confrontation was at hand. "I think you'll be surprised by how many families are ready to stand with you." The schoolhouse sat on a hill overlooking the church, and when they arrived, Clara was amazed to see more than 50 people assembled. Not just the families she knew had been directly affected by the land fraud, but others who understood that this fight was about more than individual property disputes. This was about whether powerful men could steal from poor families without consequence, and whether justice was possible when the victims were people without political influence or financial resources. Mr. Henderson stood up as Clara and Eulalie entered the building. "Miss Johnson," he said formally, "we've been discussing the situation, and we want you to know that this community stands behind you. Whatever happens when you face Caldwell and his associates, you won't face them alone." Clara felt a surge of emotion as she looked around the room at faces that had become familiar over the past weeks. People who had shared their family stories, their legal documents, their hopes for justice. But she also felt the weight of their expectations, the knowledge that her decisions would affect not just her own life, but the lives of everyone in this room. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "But I need you to understand what we're up against. These aren't just local businessmen trying to make a profit. According to grandmother's research, they're part of a larger organization with connections to political leaders and law enforcement. If we expose them, they'll fight back with everything they have." "Let them fight," said a voice from the back of the room. Clara turned to see Mrs. Whitfield, flanked by several of the community's older residents. "Some of us have been waiting 20 years for this chance. We're not going to back down now because it might be dangerous." Eulalie moved to the front of the room, and Clara was struck by the way her grandmother seemed to transform in front of the assembled community. The fragile elderly woman who had needed help moving the memorial stone was gone, replaced by someone who radiated quiet authority and unshakable resolve. "Friends," Eulalie said, "tonight we will do something that should have been done years ago. We will present evidence of systematic fraud to federal authorities. We will demand the restoration of stolen property to its rightful owners. And we will ensure that the men responsible for these crimes face justice." She reached into her bag and withdrew what Clara immediately recognized as another key. Not brass, like the one she'd found in the grass, not silver like the compass, but something that looked like it had been forged from melted gold and set with small gemstones. "This is the master vault key," Eulalie explained. "It was made from jewelry donated by the families who lost their land, wedding rings, family heirlooms, precious things they sold to try to keep their farms before they were forced out. The gold and stones were melted down and reformed into this key, which unlocks not just the main vault, but all the subsidiary hiding places where evidence has been stored over the years." Clara took the key, feeling its weight and warmth. Unlike the other keys she'd found, this one seemed to pulse with significance, as if it contained not just the power to open locks, but the hopes and dreams of everyone who had contributed to its creation. "But we need to be strategic about this," Eulalie continued. "Caldwell and his men are still at the church, probably planning to search it thoroughly once they're convinced we're not hiding inside. That gives us an opportunity to approach on our own terms, with our own witnesses and our own evidence." Over the next hour, they planned what Clara realized was essentially a siege. Community members would position themselves around the church property, ensuring that any violence or intimidation would have plenty of witnesses. A delegation would ride to the county seat to alert federal marshals about what was happening. Most importantly, Clara and Eulalie would return to the church openly, carrying with them enough evidence to make their case publicly and undeniably. As the meeting broke up and people began moving toward their assigned positions, Clara found herself alone with her grandmother for the first time since they'd met. The emotions of the day, fear, excitement, determination, and love for this remarkable woman who had shaped her destiny, threatened to overwhelm her. "Grandmother," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Why me? I understand that I'm your granddaughter, but there must have been other choices, other ways to handle this. Why did you decide to make an 11-year-old girl responsible for something this important?" Eulalie sat down on one of the school benches and patted the space beside her. "Sit with me, child, and I'll tell you something about our family that you need to know." Clara settled beside her grandmother, acutely aware that Jasper had positioned himself between them and the door. alert for any signs of approaching danger. Your great-great-grandmother was born into slavery in Virginia, Eulalie began. She was freed after the war, but she understood something that many people didn't, that freedom on paper doesn't mean much if you don't have the power to protect it. She taught her children that justice isn't something that just happens. It's something you have to fight for. Generation after generation. Your great-grandmother homesteaded in Kansas during the 1870s, one of the first black families to claim land under the Homestead Act. When white settlers tried to run her off, she stood her ground with a rifle and legal papers, and she won. She taught her daughter, my mother, that education and documentation were the keys to protecting what was rightfully ours. My mother passed those lessons on to me, and I've spent my life putting them into practice. But I'm old, Clara, and this fight needs someone young enough to see it through to the end. More than that, it needs someone who understands what we're really fighting for, not just individual property rights, but the principle that poor people deserve the same justice as rich people. Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes as she began to understand the full weight of what she'd inherited. You're asking me to carry on something that's been passed down through 4 generations of our family. I'm asking you to be the one who finally wins, Eulalie said simply. The one who turns all this struggle and sacrifice into actual justice for the people who need it most. Outside, the sun was setting, and Clara could see lanterns beginning to appear around the church as community members took their positions. The final confrontation was approaching, and she knew that everything her family had worked for over the course of generations would be decided in the next few hours. "What if I fail?" she asked. "Then you'll have failed fighting for what's right, which is better than succeeding at something that's wrong," her grandmother replied. "But I don't think you'll fail, Clara. I've watched you these past weeks, seen how you've approached every challenge, every decision. You have the kind of courage that doesn't come from not being afraid. It comes from being afraid and choosing to act anyway." As they prepared to leave the schoolhouse, Clara realized that her understanding of courage had fundamentally changed. A few weeks ago, she had thought brave people were those who weren't afraid of anything. Now she understood that real courage was about feeling the fear, acknowledging the danger, and choosing to do the right thing anyway. The master vault key was warm in her hand as they walked toward the wagon that would take them back to the church. Around them, members of their community were taking positions in the darkness, ready to witness whatever happened next. Above them, storm clouds were gathering, suggesting that the confrontation would take place against the backdrop of thunder and lightning. "Are you ready?" Eulalie asked as they climbed into the wagon. Clara looked at the key in her hand, thought about the $29 million waiting to be returned to its rightful owners, and considered the powerful men who would do anything to prevent that from happening. She thought about her parents, who had taught her always to stand up for what was right. She thought about her great-great-grandmother, born into slavery, but determined to claim her freedom. She thought about all the families counting on her to succeed where others had failed. "I'm ready," she said. And as the wagon began moving toward the church, Clara felt the full weight of her inheritance settling on her shoulders. Not just money and property, but generations of struggle for justice, and the responsibility to see that struggle through to its rightful conclusion. The final battle for justice was about to begin, and Clara Belle Johnson was ready to claim her place in the long line of women who had refused to surrender in the face of power and corruption. The church was dark when they arrived, but Clara could see lanterns burning inside and the shadows of men moving around the sanctuary. Caldwell and his associates had clearly made themselves comfortable while searching for the hidden entrance to the underground chambers. "They're getting desperate," Eulalie observed quietly as they approached on foot, having left the wagon hidden in the trees. Desperate men make dangerous decisions, but they also make mistakes. Clara could feel her heart racing as they reached the church steps. This was the moment everything had been building toward, not just the past few weeks of investigation, but years of her grandmother's careful planning and generations of her family's struggle for justice. The front door stood open, and they could hear Caldwell's voice from inside, sharp with frustration. "Tear up every floorboard if you have to. There's something here, and I want it found before dawn." Clara looked at her grandmother, who nodded once. Together they stepped across the threshold into the church where it had all begun. "Gentlemen," Eulalie said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "I believe you're looking for me." The activity inside the church stopped abruptly. Caldwell spun around, his face registering shock at seeing the woman whose death certificate he'd presumably seen years earlier. His three companions, all of them armed, Clara noticed with a chill, moved to flank their boss, their hands resting on their weapons. "Impossible," Caldwell breathed. "You're dead." "I have the certificate." "You have a forgery," Eulalie corrected. "Just like all those land deeds you've been using to steal property from honest families. The difference is that my death was staged to protect evidence, while your documents were forged to commit theft." Clara moved slightly behind her grandmother, not from cowardice, but from strategic thinking. She could see through the windows that their community allies had taken positions around the church as planned, their lanterns creating a ring of light that would make it difficult for Caldwell's men to escape unnoticed. "Where is it?" Caldwell demanded, his composure cracking completely. 20 years of careful work, and you've been hiding somewhere like a rat, collecting evidence that should have been destroyed long ago. The evidence that proves you've stolen millions of dollars from families throughout this region, Eulalie asked. "The documents that show your entire organization is built on fraud and corruption. That evidence is safely stored where it can be presented to federal authorities." One of Caldwell's men stepped forward, his hand now openly gripping his pistol. "Enough talking. We came here for something specific, and we're not leaving without it." That's when Clara realized this. Confrontation wasn't just about exposing the land fraud. It was about the $29 million in stolen wealth that Caldwell somehow knew existed. These men weren't just trying to silence witnesses. They were trying to recover money they considered theirs by right of theft. "The treasure," Clara said, understanding flooding through her. "You know about the treasure." Caldwell's eyes shifted to her for the first time, and Clara saw something that chilled her to the bone. Not just greed, but the cold calculation of someone who would do anything necessary to get what he wanted. "Smart girl," he said. "Smarter than your grandmother gave you credit for, I suspect." "Yes, we know about the money. We've known for months that it was hidden somewhere in this area. What we didn't know was exactly where or how to access it." "You can't have it," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the families you stole it from. It belongs to whoever has the strength to take it," Caldwell replied. "And right now, that's us." But as he spoke, Jasper emerged from the shadows near the altar, moving with the purposeful stride of a dog who understood exactly what was happening. Instead of cowering or hiding, he positioned himself directly between Clara and the armed men, his lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed every tooth. "Call off the dog," one of Caldwell's men said nervously. "He's not going to attack unless you threaten us," Clara said, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. Jasper looked different than she'd ever seen him. Not the gentle companion who slept at the foot of her bed, but the trained guardian her grandmother had raised him to be. "Then I guess we'll have to see how much that dog's life means to you," Caldwell said, nodding to his men. That's when the massive steel door of the underground vault became visible. Clara hadn't seen it during their earlier exploration, but now she realized that the natural cave had been reinforced with engineering that went far beyond simple hiding places. Set into the rock wall behind the altar was a door that belonged in a bank rather than a rural church. Thick steel with multiple locks and reinforcement that would resist dynamite. "Impressive," Caldwell said, studying the door. "Your grandmother was more paranoid than we gave her credit for. But even the best locks can be opened with the right motivation." He looked meaningfully at Clara, and she understood the threat. They would use her safety to force her grandmother to open the vault. What they didn't understand was that Clara had something they couldn't account for: the master vault key, hidden in her pocket, and the determination to use it on her own terms. "Grandmother," she said quietly, "I think it's time." Eulalie looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "Are you certain, child? Once we open that door, there's no going back." "There's already no going back," Clara replied. "These men will never leave us alone as long as they think we have something they want. The only way to end this is to show them and everyone else exactly what we've been protecting." Outside, she could hear the sound of more horses arriving, but whether they belonged to federal marshals or more of Caldwell's associates, she couldn't tell. What she could see were the lanterns of their community supporters, still maintaining their positions despite the obvious danger. Clara stepped forward and produced the master vault key, its gold surface gleaming in the lamplight. "This opens more than just locks," she said to Caldwell. "It opens the truth. Are you prepared for everyone to see what that truth looks like?" For the first time since the confrontation had begun, Caldwell looked uncertain. Clara realized that he had expected to find a treasure he could steal quietly, not evidence that would be presented publicly. The idea that his crimes might be exposed to federal authorities and community witnesses had not been part of his plan. "Open it," he demanded. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Clara looked at her grandmother, who nodded once. Together, they approached the massive steel door that had protected $29 million in stolen wealth for 15 years. As Clara inserted the master key into the first lock, she felt the weight of generations of struggle for justice, and the knowledge that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether that struggle had been worth the sacrifice. The first lock clicked open with a sound like thunder as the vault door swung open, revealing the carefully organized treasure within. Clara heard something that made her heart surge with hope, the sound of official voices outside the church, speaking with the authority of federal law enforcement. "This is Marshal Williams of the United States Marshals Service," came a voice from the churchyard. "By order of the federal court, this property is under investigation for suspected land fraud. No one is to leave until we've had an opportunity to interview all parties." Caldwell's face went white. "How did they—" "Because Mrs. Washington rode to the county seat hours ago," Clara said, understanding dawning as she spoke. "Because this was never just about us confronting you. It was about creating a situation where federal authorities would have no choice but to investigate your crimes." But even as she spoke, Clara realized that the situation was far from resolved. Caldwell and his men were trapped, but they were also desperate. And desperate men with weapons were dangerous regardless of who was outside. "If I'm going down," Caldwell said grimly, "I'm not going alone. Open that vault completely, and let me see what 15 years of investigation has produced." Clara looked into the underground chamber, seeing not just the money and gold, but something else. A document case that her grandmother approached with reverence. "The original town charter," Eulalie said, withdrawing a large official document that was clearly much older than anything else in the collection. "Signed in 1837, establishing this community and granting land rights to all founding families. Every deed you've forged, every property you've stolen, every family you've displaced, it's all documented here as illegal under the original charter." Clara stared at the document, realizing its significance. This wasn't just evidence of individual crimes, but proof that the entire legal framework Caldwell's organization had used to justify their actions was fraudulent. "That charter was superseded by state legislation," Caldwell said, but his voice lacked conviction. "State legislation that was passed through bribes and political corruption, as documented in these files," Eulalie replied, gesturing to the organized evidence around them. "Federal marshals will find records of payments to legislators, forged signatures on bills, and testimony from witnesses who were intimidated into silence." The sound of footsteps approaching the church made everyone tense. Clara could see lanterns moving toward the building, and she realized that the final moment of confrontation was at hand. "Marshal Williams!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. "We're in here, and we have evidence you need to see." But Caldwell wasn't finished. With the desperation born of seeing his entire criminal enterprise about to collapse, he lunged toward the document case containing the town charter, clearly intending to destroy the most damaging evidence against him. That's when Jasper proved just how well Eulalie had trained him. The dog moved with lightning speed, placing himself between Caldwell and the documents, his snarl making it clear that anyone who wanted to reach the evidence would have to go through him first. "Get that animal away from me," Caldwell shouted, drawing his pistol. But before he could aim it at Jasper, Clara stepped forward with a courage that surprised even herself. "You'll have to shoot me first," she said simply. "And I don't think you want to murder an 11-year-old girl in front of federal marshals." The standoff lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, Clara felt the transformation that had been building throughout her investigation finally complete itself. She was no longer the uncertain child who had inherited a mysterious church. She was the granddaughter of Clara Johnson, the keeper of evidence that would restore justice to an entire community, and the person willing to risk everything to see that justice served. "Miss Johnson," Marshal Williams called from the church entrance.
"Are you safe?"
"We're safe, Marshal," Clara replied, her eyes never leaving Caldwell's face. "But we have evidence of crimes that need immediate federal investigation." The next few minutes were a blur of activity as federal marshals entered the church, secured Caldwell and his associates, and began examining the evidence that Clara and her grandmother presented. The town charter, the forged land deeds, the documented payments to corrupt officials, and the systematic theft of millions of dollars. It was all laid out with the meticulous organization that Eulalie had maintained for 15 years. But what impressed Clara most was the community response. As word spread that the confrontation was over and justice was finally being served, families began arriving at the church, not just those who had been directly affected by the land fraud, but neighbors and friends who understood that this victory belonged to everyone who had ever been cheated by powerful men who believed themselves above the law. Mrs. Washington was there, tears streaming down her face as she held the original deed to her family's farm. Mr. Henderson stood with his arm around his wife, both of them staring in amazement at documents that proved their family's claim to land they had lost 20 years earlier. The Morrison children, now adults, looked at evidence that their parents' suffering had not been in vain. "Clara," Marshal Williams said as the immediate crisis passed, "I need you to understand something. This evidence you've preserved, it's going to result in the largest property restoration in Missouri history. Dozens of families will get their land back, and the men responsible for stealing it will face federal charges that carry serious prison time." Clara looked around at the faces of people she had come to know and care about, understanding that her inheritance had been not just money and property, but the power to heal wounds that had festered for generations. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we begin the process of making things right," Eulalie said, putting her arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. "It will take time and there will be legal challenges, but the hardest part is over. The truth is finally public, and truth has a power that even corrupt men can't fight forever." As the night wore on and federal marshals continued documenting evidence, Clara realized that her understanding of wealth had fundamentally changed. The $29 million in the vault was valuable, but not as valuable as the justice it would restore. The documents were precious, but not as precious as the families who would be reunited with their land. Most precious of all was the knowledge that when faced with the choice between personal safety and community justice, she had chosen correctly. She had honored not just her grandmother's legacy, but the legacy of generations of women who had refused to surrender in the face of power and corruption. The final battle was over, and justice had won. 6 months later, Clara stood on the steps of the same church where her adventure had begun. But everything around her had transformed. The building itself showed signs of careful restoration. The white paint gleamed in the morning sunlight, the windows sparkled clean, and the cemetery behind it had been tended with loving care by families reclaiming their heritage. In her hands, she held a folder containing the newest additions to the community's collection of justice, fresh property deeds, signed by federal judges and witnessed by marshals, that restored ownership of stolen land to 37 families throughout the region. Each document represented not just legal victory, but the healing of wounds that had festered for decades. The Washington family had been among the first to receive their restored deed, and Mrs. Washington had wept openly as she held the paper that proved her family's ownership of land. They had worked as tenant farmers for 20 years. The Hendersons had immediately begun planning improvements to the farm they could now call their own. The Morrison children had decided to pool their resources and work their parents' land together, creating a family operation that would honor the struggle their parents had endured. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had been in the community itself. The shared experience of fighting for justice had created bonds between families that transcended old divisions. Black families and white families, who had rarely spoken before the land fraud crisis, now worked together on community projects. Young people who had been planning to leave for opportunities in larger cities were staying to help rebuild what corruption had torn apart. Clara's own life had changed in ways she was still learning to understand. The legal proceedings had resulted in her becoming something of a celebrity, with newspaper reporters traveling from as far as St. Louis to interview the 11-year-old girl who had exposed the largest land fraud case in Missouri history. But more importantly, she had discovered that her inheritance included not just wealth and property, but a role in her community that would shape the rest of her life. "Child," Eulalie said, approaching from the direction of the farmhouse where she now lived openly with Aunt Minerva. "Are you ready for today's ceremony?" Clara looked at her grandmother, marveling at how different she seemed now, that she no longer had to hide her identity or live in fear of discovery. Eulalie had officially returned from the dead through a legal process that had been both complex and somewhat amusing, involving testimony from dozens of community members who had been quietly helping her over the years. "I think so," Clara replied. "It still feels strange, being responsible for decisions that affect so many people." The ceremony Clara was preparing for was the formal distribution of the last portion of the recovered treasure. After months of legal proceedings, federal investigators had determined that approximately $26 million could be returned directly to families who had documented claims to stolen property. The remaining $3 million had been designated for community improvements, a new school, repairs to roads and bridges, and a fund to help families transition back to land ownership. As the chosen administrator of these funds, Clara had found herself in the unprecedented position of being one of the most influential people in the county, despite not yet being old enough to vote. She had handled the responsibility with a maturity that amazed adults who had known her since childhood, making decisions based not on personal preference, but on careful consideration of what would do the most good for the most people. "Your great-great-grandmother would be proud," Eulalie said, as they walked toward the gathering crowd. "She always said that the measure of a person's character wasn't how much they could acquire, but how wisely they could distribute what they had been trusted with." Jasper trotted beside them, his demeanor completely different from the anxious dog who had once refused to enter the church. His duty as guardian of the treasure was complete, but he had found a new role as Clara's constant companion and unofficial mascot of the community restoration project. Children who visited the church for the educational programs Clara had established always asked to meet the dog who helped solve the mystery, and Jasper accepted their attention with dignity befitting his important place in the story. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Federal Judge Harrison, who had overseen the legal proceedings, presented each family with their official property deed in a brief speech that acknowledged both the injustice they had endured and the courage they had shown in pursuing justice. Clara watched from the church steps as grown men and women wept with joy. As children learned they would inherit land their grandparents had thought was lost forever, and as an entire community celebrated the restoration of what had been stolen. When the formal presentations were complete, the gathering transformed into the kind of community celebration that Clara was learning to treasure above all other aspects of her new life. Tables appeared loaded with food, contributed by families who finally had gardens and livestock of their own again. Children played games in the churchyard, while adults shared stories and made plans for the future. Musicians brought instruments, and soon the sound of fiddles and harmonicas filled the air with songs that spoke of home and hope and justice finally served. As evening approached and the crowd began to thin, Clara found herself alone with her thoughts in the church that had started it all. The building had become more than just her property. It was now the community center, hosting everything from school classes to town meetings to wedding ceremonies. The irony wasn't lost on her that a place once used to hide from corruption had become the symbol of transparent, community-based decision-making. "Any regrets?" Aunt Minerva asked, joining Clara in the quiet sanctuary. Clara considered the question seriously. The past months had been demanding in ways she couldn't have imagined when she first inherited the church. She had been forced to grow up quickly, to make difficult decisions, to handle responsibilities that would have challenged adults. Her childhood had been forever changed by the knowledge of how much injustice existed in the world, and how much courage it took to fight against it. But she had also discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed, had formed relationships with people she might never have met otherwise, and had learned that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property, but the knowledge that she came from a line of women who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. "No regrets," she said finally. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd never found that brass key, but I don't think I'd want to go back and change anything. This feels like what I was supposed to do." As the last of the celebration wound down and families headed home to farms and houses they truly owned for the first time in decades, Clara stood in the doorway of the church with Jasper at her side and watched the community she had helped heal settling into the peace of a summer evening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still legal appeals to handle, still families working through the complex process of reclaiming their heritage, still improvements to plan and implement. But tonight, as fireflies began to dance in the warm air and the sounds of contented families drifted across the prairie, Clara felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served, that wrongs had been righted, and that her grandmother's long struggle had finally reached its intended conclusion. The church bells, silent for so many years, had been repaired and now rang clearly across the landscape, calling the community to worship, to celebration, and to the ongoing work of building a society where powerful men could not simply take what they wanted from those with less power. Clara Belle Johnson, no longer just an orphaned girl, but now a young woman with a community to help lead and a legacy to uphold, listened to those bells and smiled, knowing that she had found her place in the long story of the fight for justice, and that the fight itself would continue in good hands for generations to come.